welcome to meeting number 71 of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to continue its study on foreign election interference. We have with us today Mr. Kenny Chiu, former Member of Parliament by video conference, as well as Mr. David Salvo, Managing Director and Senior Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States by video conference. Mr. Chiu, welcome to PROC. We now pass the floor to you for your opening comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you all hear me fine?
Yes, we do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your invitation. Freedom, democracy, and the rule of law are not cliched. In fact, many from around the world have chosen Canada because of the respect and practice of these ideals. Arguably, those who are from the outside come to treasure and want to protect it even more so because many of us have seen and lived lives without these rights. 21st century Canada, it's a multicultural society with immigrants and refugees from all continents and all walks of life, calling their settlement home. It is beautiful and ideal world that those before us in this generation have worked so hard to build. A fair, respectable, multicultural society that honors diversity yet commits to preserving the uniqueness and the very essence of being Canadian. Those much cherished ideals of equality, universal values, and human dignity. Authoritarian regimes around the world, however, do not ascribe to this same value system we believe in. Not only so, they would work to undermine us, to turn our countries into subservient states, kowtowing to their direct influence, be it the Russian Federation, China, Iran, or other less resourceful or ambitious regimes. They are willing to sacrifice our trusted institutions, the harmonious society we have carefully built over the decades, and the people that are in it. I used to be a partisan politician, but now that I'm back as an ordinary Canadian citizen, I continue to share with millions of fellow Canadians the same deep level of worry and concerns for my adopted country, because foreign interference, it's a national threat. It should have been a pan-partisan issue. To protect the country and its people, it's arguably the top job as any sovereign government. Yet, we're seeing an inexplicable action-free policy exercised by our federal government vis-a-vis interference from the most resourceful and the ambitious of all foreign state, the Chinese Communist Party regime. To be clear, the government is not mute or not seen to have done something. It loudly verbalized its spontaneous concerns and cited SITE, CSE, NCCOP, NZERA, CEIPP, CSIS, and lately a repertoire as proof of things it has done. But none of that, I would argue, has protected sufficiently the 21st century Canada that we're in. And in my experience, my country did not protect me from foreign interference and the attacks that I've experienced. In a thriving, diverse, multicultural country such as ours, it is up to those who are in power to stop the corruption and the deceits, to safeguard the exposed and the vulnerable few, to safeguard Canadians of all mother tongues from predatory states, their coercion, and to safeguard Canada from exploitation and manipulation. I thank you for giving me this opportunity to answer many of the questions that you may have to share my views. Lately, in Canadian broadcasting world, we have seen more than sufficient coverage on the issue and the challenges that have presented us today. And I urge all of you to take some action to determine to stand up and protect our country and especially the people that are in this country. Thank you for the opportunity again.
Thank you, Mr. Chu. Now, Mr. Salvo, welcome to PROC. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished members of the committee, good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for inviting me. I was asked to discuss the collaboration of my organization, the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund, with the Government of Canada and Microsoft on a joint initiative, which brought together leading experts, policymakers, and industry professionals from around the world to produce a practical guide of best practices that key stakeholders in democracies can use to counter foreign interference in elections. To provide some context to what motivated us to join this partnership with your government, it's worth briefly explaining the genesis of the Alliance for Securing Democracy. We launched in the summer of 2017 to put Russia's interference in the 2016 US presidential election into context for American policymakers and offer solutions on how to better defend our democratic institutions and processes from autocratic threats, not just from Russia, but from other state-sponsored actors like China and Iran. The name Alliance was very deliberate. What happened in the United States did not occur in a vacuum. Over many decades, Russian interference has targeted numerous democracies, including several of Canada and the US's allies and partners in Europe. Autocrats' tools of interference, which include cyber operations, malign finance, and information manipulation, among many others, have been refined to exploit modern technologies and target all sectors of democratic society. And we knew that as a civil society organization, we had some small role to play in facilitating the exchange of best practices between governments, companies, and other civil society orgs, and to learn lessons from across sectors and national borders in order to offer guidance to policymakers and shut down institutional vulnerabilities in our democracy. In this regard, our partnership with the Government of Canada and Microsoft on combating election interference as part of the French government's Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace was at the heart of what we do. The compendium of best practices that we published along with the Government of Canada and Microsoft offers reminders of best methods to secure election infrastructure, procedures to ensure voting integrity during a pandemic, transparent ways of communicating with the public about threats to elections, and best practices in building citizen resilience to disinformation. It even highlights examples of Canadian good practice, which include Canadian Heritage's programs to fund civil society initiatives to tackle election-related mis- and disinformation, and the government-wide critical election incident public protocol. If used as intended, Canada's protocol should be an excellent model of transparency and communication with the public to reduce the likelihood of politicians manipulating threat information about election interference. This compendium of best practices is not just in circulation in Canada and the United States, of course. It is being put to good use around the world. Anecdotally, US government colleagues have informed me that they disseminate the compendium to government counterparts in the global South, where many nations are under-resourced and increasingly at the forefront of Russian and Chinese malign influence operations. In Canada, you do not need me to tell you that foreign interference in democracy remains a serious challenge. The rise in Chinese state-sponsored interference in Canadian democracy through targeting specific ridings and candidates in elections, malign financial coercion, and subversion of civil society, including the Chinese Canadian diaspora, has been well documented and on the agenda of your committee, of course. Russian state-sponsored actors have amplified domestic divisions on issues of heightened political sensitivity, including the war in Ukraine, vaccination mandates, the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, and economic hardships facing Canadian voters. Undermining Canadians' confidence in democratic governance and the integrity of Canadian elections is an overarching objective of these authoritarian regimes. Therefore, the compendium of best practices that we published continues to be a useful guide, not just in Canada, but for democracies worldwide. It's illustrative not only of the importance of cataloging the policies and procedures that can secure elections, to rising autocratic threats, but also of the utility of conducting such multi-stakeholder exercises. No nation, government, company, or civil society organization is an island unto itself. By working together as allies and breaking down barriers between governments, industry, and civil society, we will be better positioned to secure democratic elections and institutions from an ever-evolving autocratic threat ecosystem. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will now start with 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mr. Turnbull, Madame Goudreau, and then Mrs. Blaney. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to direct my questions for you to Mr. Chu. Mr. Chu, do you believe that you were the target of Beijing's interference in the 2021 election?
Yes, sir.
And what do you base that on? Can you describe some of the incidents that occurred in your riding and some other experiences that you had on the campaign trail?
Well, thank you for the question. The experience is not just within my riding, as we all know, as you all know, as federal politicians. A lot of time, especially in your election time, the party's platform and the party's leadership accounts for a large amount of votes that would be voting at you or not. So many of the disinformation that I observe, it's leveled against my party, misconstruing the platform, as well as attacking the leader back then that for the Conservative Party of Canada, Mr. Erin O'Toole, and also level at myself as well. For Mr. Erin O'Toole, they attacked him as if he's a white supremacist, that he's anti-Chinese, anti-Asian, and that as if it's not ridiculous enough. They level similar attacks on me personally. The fact that I'm an ethnic Chinese, I speak fluent Cantonese and Mandarin, I read and write the language itself, and yet it doesn't prevent them from labeling that I'm a traitor, that I'm a sellout for what I have proposed in the last session of Parliament. It's my private member bill, Bill C-282, the Foreign Interference Registry Act. It's been misinterpreted and misconstrued as something that would cause persecution against all Chinese Canadians, causing them significant grief. And these are things that I've seen and personally experienced.
Thank you. And do you believe it was coordinated?
The level of organization, the various facets, and especially contrasting to previous elections that I was involved, yes, I believe it is organized.
Now, we know that the Rapid Response Mechanism at Global Affairs detected a Beijing-driven disinformation campaign targeting you and targeting other candidates that were conservative candidates, specifically in the Lower Mainland. Did anyone from the National Security Establishment or from the Site Task Force ever reach out to you about this disinformation campaign? And I guess by the Site Task Force, I mean the election panel that had been established.
No, sir. None of these national security apparatus have contacted me. I have, however, been contacted prior to the election by Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And therefore, during the election, when I observe unbecoming activities, significant evidence that shows me that there had been a coordinated attack against me and my party, I gave a call to the same CSIS contact that I had. And they came to my campaign office and we had a meeting.
And there was no follow, and when would have that taken place approximately?
It will be in September 2021.
How long before the election?
Oh, it would be 10 days, maybe 2 weeks max.
Thank you for that. And you heard nothing back, and as far as you know, no further action was taken by the critical election incident public protocol.
Negative, I have not.
And you said that with respect to this government, that there is an inexplicable action-free policy when it comes to countering Beijing's interference. Can you elaborate upon that?
Well, the foreign interference started by the Beijing authority, it's not something new. We know that, for example, Hussein Shaleo being kidnapped by the Uzbeks police per directions by the CCP. And then followed by 2014, Kevin and Julia Garrett's, the hostage diplomacy that was involved. And then the two Michaels. These are things that are happening to Canadians overseas, perhaps. But at the same time, we also know that for years, CSIS under Dick Fadden, for example. And
Mr. Chu, I apologize to interrupt, but as you can appreciate, as a former member of Parliament yourself, my time is very limited, so I'll put it to you this way. Do you believe that the election integrity defense infrastructure that this government has established is adequate to deal with Beijing's foreign interference tactics? And if
I
you
don't
can
know about
elaborate on that.
I don't know about adequate or not, but I surely do not think that it's been effective.
You would submit that it was not effective in your riding, obviously.
In my writing and in a couple other writing that I've been paying attention to, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Turnbull?
Thanks, Mr. Chu and Mr. Salvo for being here today. Mr. Chu, I'll start with you. Would you agree that any form of foreign interference or domestic interference is wrong and should be stopped?
It depends on what you define as domestic interference. If you define it as what CEIPP has written in the report, then yes, it's something that we Canadians need to pay attention to as domestic interference. But foreign interference has no place in Canada, in my opinion.
So you're against foreign interference but okay with domestic interference, or you're against both?
Well, we have election laws, and every Canadian domestically will have to abide to the Canadian Elections Act.
Okay.
Now, whether you can clearly separating domestic from foreigns, it's a separate issue.
Okay, great. And so, I mean, the reason I bring up domestic interference is that your party sent out flyers across my riding in one of the elections, which misinformed the public right across my riding. So it's interesting that we're here talking about foreign interference, but you know, I think we should equally be opening up the conversation to talk about domestic interference. Anyway, I'll move on from that, but you lost the last election, as far as I understand, by 9% of the vote, and that's approximately 3,500 votes, and you maintain that foreign election interference was the reason you lost. Is that true?
Well, Mr. Turnbull, if you can answer me how many, what is the voter turnout rate for my riding, and as compared to 22 months ago in 2019 election, then you will see that a lot of the supporters, a lot of voters have been staying at home.
So, but I mean, I guess what I want to establish here is, did you lose by 9% of the vote or not?
The candidate who took the riding, who won the riding, was by a margin of 9%. I agree. Yes.
Okay, good. And how?
3,400 some.
Thank you for that. And how many votes do you think were impacted by foreign interference?
If I can have camera installed on each and every booth and look at how people voted, then I will be able to, for certain, answer your question, sir.
Mr. Chu, thank you for that. So you admit that you don't exactly know how many votes were impacted by foreign interference. Is that the case?
There will be no way anybody, including CEIPP, to tell that foreign interference is not a factor of an election result in my riding.
Thank you. So that's a clear answer that we don't know, and I think that's true. Although there's evidence in a report that I found and read very intently, which is called Misinformation and Disinformation During the 2021 Canadian federal election, and it actually goes through a very detailed analysis of and mentions your riding and the disinformation campaign that you are subject to, which I don't think anyone doubts. I want to quote a couple of quotes from this report. So they say, if it is, so I quote, if it is these Chinese Canadian voters who shifted against the Conservative Party, it should be detectable in the survey data. We evaluated whether Chinese Canadians switched their vote intentions or changed their evaluations of the Conservative Party using survey data collected during the campaign and just after the election. We compared Chinese Canadians' vote intentions during the first 2 weeks of the campaign to their vote intentions during the last 2 weeks, with the result in figure 2022. Here's the important part, and I quote, the two left panels show that there was no change in voter intentions. So that's interesting because that demonstrates the exact opposite of what you're maintaining and what you have said publicly numerous times. So given the fact that you don't know, and you've now said that on the record here at this committee, then, and there's evidence to suggest that there actually was no change in voter intentions, how can you maintain what you believe?
Well, I haven't read the survey or the report of the survey, and I will be very keen to understand that what language of the surveys it's conducted in. You mentioned about, sir, Chinese. There is no homogeneous Chinese in my writing. They're Chinese from Taiwan. They're Chinese from Hong Kong. They're Chinese from mainland China. Some of them use WeChat, especially the mainland Chinese. Some of them solely rely on WhatsApp, the Hong Kong Chinese, and also the Taiwanese Chinese, they use Line as a communication means. I don't know when was the last time you picked up the phone that you don't know the number of, but perhaps I would probably refer the committee to also study the McGill University data miner professors study on this information that I experienced, or maybe this InfoWatch, as well as the
Thank you, Mr.
Digital Forensic Research Lab.
Just to get a last quote and question in here, the report also, and I'll quote it one more time, we also did not find evidence that those using WeChat for political information were less likely to support the Conservative Party, or that using WeChat had a different impact on East Asians than other Canadians. So again, this report actually has a significant amount of evidence that contradicts the claims that you've been making. So I wonder if you've read the report that I'm referring to.
Mr. Turnbull, like I said, there had been significant research done on this, including disinfowatch.org. There has been also studies conducted by the Digital Forensic Research Lab, and as well as the McGill University data miner professors. And I wonder if you, sir, have read any of their studies. And to answer straightly to your question, no, I have not read that particular one report that does not collaborate with what's been reported by CSIS whistleblowers, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chu. Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Madame Goudreau.
Merci. Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to come back to Mr. Chu with your appearance on 31 March when you said that there was a plot, and you talked about WeChat concerning the anti-Chinese allegations. And how did you identify these kinds of threats, potential threats?
Well, thank you for the question. During an election campaign, you have many volunteers and also supporters volunteering for you. And many of my volunteers and supporters, they are people from the community. I did observe a significant detachment from supporting me between 2019 and 2021. There has been a significant drop in mainland Chinese background supporter in my campaign in 2021. However, there are still volunteers in my campaign that have access to WeChat, and they are also participants in the WhatsApp chat rooms. And therefore, they pay witness to many of the spreading of the disinformation, organizing to defeat Kenny Chiu, organizing to defeat conservatives in general.
Thank you. Once again, you also said that you were happy, in fact, that there was a statement from CSIS concerning this interference, and you said that nobody had contacted you. And can you say what the steps were that led to your conclusion that nobody contacted you and concerning the interference?
In my term as a member of parliament, I've been first contacted by CSIS soon after 2020, I believe, and it was an abrupt connection with through my home phone here, and then through my office in Ottawa, we sat down and chatted for the first time. It was all shouted in secrecy. They would not tell me why they want to meet me, and similar meetings were conducted 2 more times during my term as an MP. And therefore, I know of a Vancouver contact of CSIS, and that's the person I contacted during the federal election. And I also tried to correct the disinformation on my own by going to YouTube and having organizing special town hall and all that. But none of that is effective. And yeah.
Donc, ce que je comprends, c'est que vous...
As I understand it, you yourself tried to investigate because I must say that this morning we heard about these suspicious tactics that have a cumulative effect, and you can even hear talk about paranoia. And what do you think about this?
Well, ma'am, the disinformation and the interference work did not start or stop just during election writ period. This is something that I wish all members in this committee understand. The foreign interference and infiltration of our community, of our country, continues till today. I'm sure you all are aware of Minister Menachino's effort in across the country to conduct a town hall study of the foreign registry establishment potential. And this has been right now in many of the community chat rooms been linked to anti-Asian racism, and also trying to stoke members of the community to speak up, to give pressure to the government so that they will not establish the foreign registries.
Maintenant, vous avez parlé.
You also referred to different gestures and acts. You mentioned earlier that there was not a sufficient response, and now we really have to try and better define what the threat is and how we can prevent this. Do you think this any effort to alert you was sufficient to prevent this interference from having an effect?
Ma'am, I don't think, first of all, I have no confidence in the established mechanism would be effectively detect and therefore provide me sufficient warning ahead of time, ahead of the attacks. Because understanding that these attacks are a lot of times using the foreign language of Mandarin and Chinese in written language, in verbal languages, in videos, in opportunities provided only to one particular candidate against the other. I don't know if the site task force is equipped to do that. And then secondly, even if I was warned, what am I going to do? How would I be able to counter this? What tools in the tool set am I, as a candidate of an election, are provided with so that I can effectively combat this? The CEIPP report mentioned about notifying Canadians with a very high threshold. The notification, I would imagine, to Canadians, even if that high threshold was met, would be probably in English and French. And none of these people who are subjected to foreign interference would be listening or receiving the message.
Thank you. Mrs. Blaney.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. And as always, all my questions go through the Chair. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Salvo, I would like to come to you first. I'm very curious. You talked about the partnership between yourself, Microsoft, and the Government of Canada, if I got that correctly. And I'm just wondering how that works, and if you could tell us a little bit about how people are educated about it. Because one of the things that we're hearing, of course, is that people don't know where to go to find relevant information. And as a member of Parliament that represents a more rural and remote riding, and I see more and more across Canada, local papers falling by the wayside, not having the resources to continue their important work to provide journalism that is actually something that can be held to a certain standard. People are going more and more online, which may or may not give you the best information. So I'm just wondering, how are we educating people about this resource?
Thank you, ma'am. It's a great question, and what's difficult, especially as a representative of civil society, is that our resources are extremely limited to do exactly the type of engagement that's necessary to make sure that these best practices get in the hands of the right people. By the right people, I mean election officials all over the country, local journalists who are in a position to educate their specific communities, mayors, people who are really on the ground in their communities. This is an extremely dense and difficult set of issues. We're talking about election administration procedure. My organization works on these issues, and I wouldn't even stick my hand up and say I'm expert in every single aspect of election administration. So to expect the ordinary citizen who doesn't spend time understanding these things, it's difficult. And the same is true for under-resourced election officials as well, all over the country. So it's really a challenge that government in particular, at the federal level, has to provide the resources for organizations, not just like mine, but for the state and local officials themselves, for provincial officials in Canada, to be able to work with the community leaders on the ground to get this information out. Because, if you look at the constituents in Mr. Chu's riding, for example, they never would have been aware of state-sponsored disinformation tactics targeting a particular campaign and what they could do to inoculate themselves against such tactics. That information is very hard to come by. So it's really incumbent, this is why we created this initiative in the first place. It's incumbent on civil society and governments in particular. It's a resource exchange, but it's also an information exchange. And where are the information gaps? Well, they're all over in this field. And, the average voter is essentially a sitting duck for a lot of these tactics. And that's why we tried to put together some sort of handbook that addresses both election administration, but also resilience. How do you provide Canadian voters with more information about these tactics, and what defenses can they adopt so that when they go to the polls, they are doing so, voting freely and fairly in their conscience without any sort of undue influence from foreign state-sponsored actors.
Well, thank you for that. And I appreciate you mentioned earlier some of the realities, for example, the convoy that we had here in Ottawa. And we know that there was foreign money, there was Russian money sent to support that convoy. And, it's quite shocking when you read the information that came out of the public inquiry, where you understand how quickly money was moving in ways that we couldn't necessarily track. And of course, that means that there's foreign money that's influencing us either during an election or around an election, which is very concerning. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, and I think you said this well, this is an issue that is rapidly changing. How things are being done is changing. So we have to have processes that are really responsive to that. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about the influence of that kind of money, and what are ways that we could track, and what are ways that we could look into the future and think, here's how we're going to monitor that so that we make sure that those dollars aren't influencing Canadians.
Absolutely. Part of the problem is that we as democracies allow the fox into the henhouse. So with a lot of our financial legislation, when the money comes in from China or Russia connected to state-sponsored actors or to the governments directly, oftentimes it's legal. It's through legal means, and it's through shell companies and real estate. And that's because in Canada and in the United States, there, at least to date, to my knowledge, there's no registry not only for foreign agents. Well, we have one in the United States, but it's poorly implemented. But Canada to date does not have one. But also on beneficial ownership registry that would at least unmask who are the hidden owners behind companies, behind property. That's how a lot of this autocratic, authoritarian money enters into Canadian politics, American politics, European politics. That's what's so insidious and sort of long-term about the use of the financial tool to corrode our democracies, because it's not always about a particular election or a particular candidate or particular riding. It's way more insidious than that. It's about moving money into our system, masking the origin of that money, presenting it as Canadian, authentic Canadian voices trying to influence Canadian politics, when there's a clear tie to an authoritarian regime like China or Russia. So tightening up laws in the financial space, this is applicable to my country too, so I'm not trying to cast stones at Canada here, but it's a problem facing a lot. And in the EU, there are many governments facing this exact same problem. So ensuring that there's full transparency over the money that's coming into our countries through property, through in companies, that is a sure way to at least expose and provide sunlight into the origins of money that's entering domestic politics from abroad.
Thank you. We'll now enter our second round, starting with Mr. Nader, followed by Ms. O'Connell. Mr. Nader, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, thank you to our witnesses. I do want to start by quoting from the study that Mr. Turnbull earlier quoted from, and it says this: "We cannot preclude the possibility, however, that there was some influence at the riding level. Moreover, the mere perception that China was able to influence the race in Steveston-Richmond East may have a chilling effect on criticism of China in Canadian politics." Moreover, if Mr. Turnbull had read the explanatory notes, he would have read that the survey data was from 689 Chinese Canadians from across the country and not specific to Mr. Chu's former riding. So I would commend to the committee the possibility of reading the entire report. But to you, Mr. Chu, looking at intimidation efforts that may have happened in your riding and other ridings where there are large diasporas of Canadians with Chinese descent, what type of impact do these types of efforts have on individuals and their families here in Canada, but also those who may have families in China, in Hong Kong, and other areas?
Thank you for a question. It's something that even I personally do not feel completely comfortable sharing my own personal experience and thoughts, knowing that the PROC committee meeting here is public and it's viewable by anybody with an internet link. So I will just recount my observations during the election time. I have senior groups at MP Alice Wong and I, both Richmond MPs, organized during the election time to meet up with them because we have seen some of these attacks that are happening to us. We thought we will be able to sit down with the senior groups to clear their mind, to clear some of the misunderstandings. So we spent about 2 or 3 hours with a group of dozen and a half. These are leaders in the senior groups, mainly mainland Chinese. Now, at the end of it, they cried. They were worried about their kids, their children, grandchildren being discriminated by Kenny Xu and the conservatives and policies. And we cleared the air. We told them none of that is true. They were reassured. They all left happy. Some of them even carry some of the snacks that we provided. Only in 24, 48 hours, I can't remember, I start seeing the same group of seniors start showing up at my opponent's campaign office, cheering for this person that they have no idea who he is, not able to communicate with, and also do not support. I know that for a matter of fact, many of the policies that my opponent's parties have espoused. So to me, that was a huge flip. And one of the leaders in the senior groups have since gone into excommunicado. He does not answer my call. He would not answer my phone, text messages, or anything, just completely detached from me.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure what was going on there. But following up, we've heard that there were no public disclosures by the CEIPP, the Elections Critical Incident Task Force, during the election campaign. Do you think that threshold is too high to trigger a public disclosure?
Sir, in order to answer your question, I would have to be able to access the CEIPP report following the mentioning of my name and Stephen Richmondese, but it's the several bullets have been redacted. There is no way for me to understand what they know and therefore provide a true answer to your question, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chu. And following up on that, do you believe it would be important that if voters in even one riding were being impacted by an organized foreign interference efforts by a foreign entity, that those people in that riding ought to be notified, that there ought to be public disclosure if even one riding is being impacted by a coordinated campaign of foreign interference?
I don't think the nation should be immediately informed, but definitely the candidates in that riding, even the benefactors, should be informed about the presence of the detection and also offer at the same time some effective counter measures that could be employed. Yes, so I believe the thresholds should be set to, at least hypothetically, when there are foreign interference detected in a particular riding, that ridings involve candidates should be informed.
Thank you. Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Mr. Chu. You had mentioned in your Australian committee testimony, and you mentioned here today as well, examples that your supporters had sent to you of disinformation on WeChat and WhatsApp. Can you provide with the committee copies of that? And do you have any evidence that it was directly organized from a foreign agent?
Ma'am, first of all, it's been almost a year and a half since the last election. Computers change hands. And I have, for example, stored some of the information on a parliamentary cell phone that it's now returned. And even that, many of the information provided to me are from my supporters. So I don't want to present to you the sense that these information are comprehensive. Besides, when CSIS sat down and met with me, I've already printed every one of them per their instructions.
Sorry,
and handed to CSIS.
I have limited time. And so if you don't have the information, but you provided it to CSIS, so CSIS and what we heard at this committee was that there was no question, there were lots of messages being spread, there was disinformation and attacks, but there couldn't be the connection that actually made it that it wasn't just Canadians that were unhappy with you or the Conservative Party. For foreign interference to take place, it has to be a coordinated effort led from a foreign entity. And so if all the information you had was presented to CSIS or the other national security community, they actually said that they couldn't determine that it wasn't just Canadians upset. And so on that point, I'd just like to point out, so there's yourself, Mr. Kenny Chiu, Carrie Deloitte, Tamara Jensen, Bob Soroya, and Alice Wong. All of those names I just read lost the 2021 election. And do you know what those members also have in common? Voting against banning conversion therapy. And in your riding in particular, the Progressive, the NDP vote actually went up 4%. And you had, it's my understanding, a very public resignation from two of your youth council members over the fact that you voted against banning conversion therapy. How much of this decision impacted your voter turnout and not voter turnout, but your election loss, when there are a number other of your colleagues who also lost and had very public negative reactions about your votes on banning conversion therapy?
Well, thank you, Mr. O'Connor, for the questions. I know you have been trying to character assassinate me from that front, but I'm sure, ma'am, you would be able to access information that I voted for conversion therapy when it was tabled. Only after the Liberal Party of Canada, through its committee, amended the bill so hard that I do not believe it strikes the balance between protecting Canadians' rights and to prevent conversion therapy from happening, that I decided to vote against it.
Right. So you voted,
therefore,
Mr. Chiu,
it's a different form of disinformation that you are trying to spread.
Well, Mr. Chiu, and you can't just refer to everything as disinformation that you don't agree with, because in fact you voted against the bill and had a very public resignation from members within your community. Sorry, Madam, through the chair, I'd also like to ask, Mr. Chiu, in 2015, you also lost the federal election. Was that as a result of foreign interference?
If you look at the information that I've been tabled or presented, I think it would be wise for the government to actually conduct a public independent inquiry on foreign interference in
Sorry,
the
Madam Chair, that wasn't the question I asked. I asked if in 2015, sorry, Madam Chair. Sorry, Mr. Chiu, I asked very clearly, in 2015, you also lost an election. Then I'm asking if that was as a result of foreign interference, and then if in 2021 the foreign interference went away, and then 2019 the foreign interference went away, and then 2021 the foreign interference came back. Those are the facts. Those are the election results from 15, 19, and 21.
Many members of the House of Commons, Member of Parliament, have tried many times. For example, my colleague Alice Wong have attempted 3 times before she was able to get elected in the riding of Richmond. And therefore, you cannot blame foreign interference for everything. In fact, I did not experience foreign interference in 2015. I did not personally experience in 2019. It doesn't preclude. And that's why I was especially sensitive to the difference. 22 months into 2019 election, there has been a sea change, and there has been volunteers that are quitting, that are staying persona non grata, as if I am the persona non grata, stay out of contact.
Thank you. I'm just going to remind Ms. O'Connell as well as Mr. Chiu that if we can't take turns, then we need to go through the chair. And I know, Mr. Chu, as somebody who has served in the House, you know the rules. Ms. O'Connell, as somebody who's serving in the House, so I'll just remind us to go through the chair if we're going to not be able just to have a conversation back and forth and take turns. With that, Madame Goudreau, 2 minutes et demi.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Chu, we've just had a demonstration of speculation, trying to find out whether this was true and where there were subversive tactics. But my question is, as we speak today, is it not necessary to shed light on the real situation? Because otherwise we'll continue just talking about this for a long time.
Pardon me, can you repeat the question again? I didn't really get the question in there. Sorry about that.
Donc, j'aimerais...
So I'd like to know, given what's happening at this very time, where there are gray areas, where there could have been partisan attacks, do you not think that an independent inquiry is more necessary than ever?
Absolutely, ma'am, because with the latest news that we have heard every day, every other week, it is becoming more and more concern for Canadians in general. I'm now just an ordinary Canadian. The people that I've come to contact with, they are wondering what is happening. How come our government has not acted to protect Canada, has not been the sunshine that they have talked about, have not been transparent to Canadians to what happened. For example, Mr. Michael Chong had indicated that the National Security Advisor told him that MPs, multiple MP, that has been targeted by the Zhao Wei, the employee of the Toronto Consulate. Well, who are the other MPs? Could it be one of them among us here? Could it be Ms. Jenny Kwan, the MP also born in Hong Kong with relatives in Hong Kong? We don't know. The government refused to answer. We only will have to live in continued fear.
Et ma dernière question.
And my last question, I'd like to know, you said earlier that it's true it's been 18 months. You limit yourself. You don't talk about too many examples. Are you afraid of reprisals?
The simple answer is yes.
I'll take that. Thank you. Mrs. Blaney, 2.5 minutes.
Well, thank you. I have no questions for Mr. Chu, but I would just ask him not to speak for other members of Parliament because I could verify that some of the things he said was incorrect. So maybe not do that for other MPs. Mr. Salvo, I would like to come back to you. In doing some research around the work that you do, I saw, hopefully I get this right, the Authoritarian Interference Tracker, which is a really amazing tool. It gives a lot of information about interference and what kind of interference, and then there's a lot of information that explains it so that if you were a civilian, you could look in there and understand what was the type of interference, what implications, and here's information about how that works. I think it's really an amazing tool. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that tool, how accessible it is. Is it something that a government like Canada could get behind in a lot more focus? And then the other thing that I just want to note, and maybe I'm just not good at using it because I didn't spend a lot of time on it, but I noticed that there was nothing that I could find that was past 2020. So I just want to ask how that, is there a process that I'm missing in that system?
Thank you very much for your question. So for those who don't know, the Authoritarian Interference Tracker is a tool, online tool that we have that maps and catalogs Russian and Chinese interference in the transatlantic community, including in Canada, since the year 2000. There are cases beyond 2020, but they may not be applicable to Canada, and but it is a living tool, so it is constantly being updated with new cases. Certainly, there are cases in Canada from the last 2 to 3 years that warrant being included. And the utility of the tool is to show two things. First, that there are several tactics that these authoritarian governments use to interfere in democracies, and ones that we may not pay attention to, like the subversion of civil society groups. So how are think tanks, student associations targeted and set up by authoritarian governments that try to mask the connections to them in order to shape discourse or promote censorship or, forbid certain topics from being discussed in academic settings or in political settings. So it's to show how these tools are used to not only interfere in elections, but to sort of shape everyday democracy and discourse in our countries. But the other utility here is hopefully to show that these tools really aren't politically motivated. They are nonpartisan when they are deployed. Yes, there are moments, and we are having a political debate about moments in which an authoritarian government might weigh in trying to shape a particular election campaign. However, really, the tracker shows hundreds of cases of how these tools are being used well outside the context of electoral democracy, simply to get Canadians and Americans and Europeans at each other's throats, and to denigrate the whole process of living in a democratic society itself.
Thank you. We're going to do just a quick 2-minute round to Mr. Culkins, followed by Mrs. Romanado. Mr. Culkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question will be for my former colleague, Mr. Chu. Mr. Chu, I'm sure you're familiar with a February 17th article published by Bob Fife and Stephen Chase, in which, in the article, it says, a month after the September 2021 vote, CSIS reported that it was well known within the Chinese-Canadian community of British Columbia that Mrs. Tong, then the Vancouver Consul General, wanted the Liberal Party to win the 2021 election. And CSIS noted that Mrs. Tong, who returned to China in July, and former Counsel Wei Jin made discreet and subtle efforts to encourage members of the Chinese-Canadian organizations to rally votes. And then in early November 2021, CSIS reported Mrs. Tong discussed the defeat of a Vancouver area Conservative whom she described as a vocal distractor of the Chinese government. And then she went on to say in this article that she helped to defeat 2 Conservative MPs in the 2021 election. Mr. Chu, do you believe you're one of those 2 MPs?
Yes, I do. Although I have not have the screenshot showing the admission of guilt from Counsel General Tong Xiaolin.
Would the other MP be?
I believe this is the other Richmond MP, Miss Alice Wong.
And why do you believe that, Mr. Chu?
Well, like I said at the beginning, the Conservative Party of Canada has been portrayed as not friendly to the CCP regime in Beijing. And therefore, it's, well, even in the article that you just referred to, sir, that according to CSIS whistleblower, the Counsel General, they also see the Conservative as less of a preference than Justin Trudeau's Liberals.
Thank you.
Mrs. Romanado, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. I will make one request from Mr. Chu, and I have a question for Mr. Salvo. Through you, Madam Chair, Mr. Chu, you mentioned that soon after 2020, you were provided a briefing by CSIS, and 2 more times. I'm going to ask you to submit the dates of those meetings that you had with CSIS to this committee for our timeline. And Mr. Salvo, you were talking a little bit about the difficulties with respect to you making sure that average Canadians and in your case Americans understand what does foreign interference look like. What are some of the tactics that are used? How can you detect, deter, and counter some of those initiatives? Can you elaborate a little bit about any advice you would have for us in terms of recommendations that perhaps parliamentarians, their staff, be briefed on such tactics, and what would you recommend our committee look at in terms of the detection and deterrence?
Thank you for your question. I think it's most important to look at what governments and countries who have been dealing with this challenge much longer than yours and mine have done to try to counter these threats and build resilience in their society. The Nordic and Scandinavian countries, the Baltic states are particularly good examples. So parliamentary exchanges, I would argue, are an excellent way to determine what, as a legislative body, you can do to not only pass legislation, but to engage in outreach in your ridings. I think that's really where a lot of the rubber meets the road. You all have cachet, presumably, with your constituents. And you are trusted, authoritative voices in your constituencies. And you know, leaving politics aside, I know that's hard, but leaving politics aside, if you put aside, say, a specific instance of interference in, say, a particular riding, and you talk about the tools and tactics that are used, and this shouldn't be controversial or partisan. Like, these are tools and tactics that have been used in dozens of countries all over the democratic space. It's not unique to Canada, as you know. It's not unique to my country. That, I think, will help, as we have learned in the States. That's really broken down some of the partisan divides to at least shed light on these tactics and make ordinary voters aware of how they might be targeted at the local level even.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I know, Mr. Salvo, you have a bit more to share, and I will ask if it's suitable, similar to the request made of Mr. Chu, if you have additional information to share with the committee, if you could just submit it to the clerk, we'll have it translated in both official languages and then shared with committee members. With that, Mr. Chu, Mr. Salvo, I would like to thank you on behalf of PROC committee members for being here. We apologize for the technical issues at the beginning of this set, but we'll be moving into our next panel. So with that, we wish you both a good rest of the day, and thank you for your time and attention today. If there's anything else, please just send it to the clerk and it will be circulated around. For the purpose of committee members, we know that bells will start shortly. Do we have agreement to work through the first 20 minutes of the bells? We'll have the clock put up on the screen so that we're all aware of it. Is that suitable? Excellent. We also, depending on what happens, will go into estimates next week. We will need a budget passed for the estimates so that we can have just the copy and so forth that we have. Are we okay with that budget being passed? Excellent. We will suspend for 2 minutes, do quick sound checks, and start on the next panel. See you shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Andre, Managing Director, DI at Toronto Metropolitan University by video conference. We also have Vivian Krause, researcher and writer by video conference. We will now start our opening remarks. Ms. Andre, let's start with yourself. Welcome. Mr. Andre, sorry, let's start with yourself. Welcome. Mr. Andre, you are on mute. Let's try that again.
Hello.
Take two. Excellent. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the invitation to address the committee today. My name is Sam Andre. I am the Managing Director of the DAIS, a policy and leadership institute at Toronto Metropolitan University, where we work to advance public policy solutions for the responsible governance of technology and a strong democracy. We have been conducting regular surveys with Canadians over the past 4 years to better understand online misinformation and to track public attitudes toward regulating online platforms. I want to first begin tonight by sharing a high level of what we understand about the spread of online misinformation in Canada from our research. About half of Canadians say they see false information online at least a few times a month. The use of online platforms for news, particularly Facebook, YouTube, and private messaging apps, is associated with higher exposure to and belief in misinformation. About 10 to 15% of Canadians have a relatively high degree of belief in misinformation and are more likely to have false or conspiratorial beliefs about many topics, such as COVID-19, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and immigration. This group tends to have lower trust in mainstream media and public institutions in general, and conversely, this group shows higher levels of trust and use in social media and messaging platforms for news, and are less likely to say that they fact-check things that they see online using another source. These collectively are conditions that can be taken advantage of by foreign actors to both seed and amplify false information online. So what are potential policy solutions to this challenge? This is not an easy question for a liberal democracy while protecting free expression and avoiding unintended consequences, including the potential to produce chilling effects, surveillance creep, and censor voices that represent the most vulnerable. There are, of course, proactive efforts that the federal government is already supporting in some ways, things like digital literacy programming in schools and communities, and in maintaining strong independent journalism. We also have measures in place now through the Canada Elections Act to monitor digital election ads and prohibit foreign parties from directly purchasing those ads. But a number of allied jurisdictions are also now advancing regulatory models that place additional legal responsibilities on online platforms to more transparently address their systemic risks to society, including their role in spreading foreign disinformation designed to undermine democratic processes. Regulatory models could, for example, advance responsibilities to require labels on synthetic or deepfake media, or to clamp down on what's commonly referred to as coordinated inauthentic behavior, a tactic that can be used by foreign actors to artificially spread false information through the use of fake or automated accounts. There are also efforts underway to improve tools that enable users to more easily fact-check or understand the context of what they come across online. For example, WhatsApp has rolled out a feature for highly forwarded messages where you can tap on a magnifying glass and send that message to a Google search. Twitter has also begun piloting its community notes feature, which allow users to add context to misleading tweets that others can then rate the helpfulness of. Nudging features like these, as well as other efforts that enable users to think twice before sharing, can help mitigate the spread of misinformation without censorship. I want to close by saying that we have found through our surveys that these platform governance proposals are widely supported by more than 80% of Canadians, and that the majority of Canadians believe the intentional spread of false information is a threat to Canadian democracy that needs to be addressed by our governments. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Andre. Ms. Krause, over to you. Welcome to PROC. You're on mute. Do we want to try that again as well? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, you can hear me now. Thank you very much for the invitation to join your meeting today. My name is Vivian Krause, and I'm from Vancouver, and I'm here appearing as an individual. The reason I'm here is because I've had 2 experiences since 2017 with Elections Canada investigations. So I think that experience perhaps can be useful in looking to see how it went and how it can be improved. Since 2017, I should say I have been involved with 2 investigations that were Lead Now and We Charity. In both cases, these were nonprofit organizations, youth-focused organizations, very different from an authoritarian state government. In both cases, the organization at the heart of the investigation had openly acknowledged that it had been trying to influence election outcomes, and in both cases, there was clear evidence of funding from outside Canada. For example, in their book, We Economy, the Kielburger brothers write, and I quote, that they had been approached by Allstate, that's the American insurance company, wanting to, and I quote, buy election results. That's page 253 of their book. They go on and they explain that, it's not what you think. What for the insurance company, the cause was youth empowerment. But the Kielburgers explain further that they had calculated that it costs $34 to, quote, buy a youth vote. Allstate gave We Charity $34 million for their youth program, which I take was enough funding for 1 million youth votes. I'm sure we all agree that we want to encourage youth voting. That's not the issue. The issue is the funding. The second point I'd like to raise is that with Lead Now, the reason this was of concern to me is because Lead Now was created by an American organization. And after the 2015 election, their executive director wrote in their annual report that year that they had run a Canadian campaign that had moved the needle, contributing greatly to the ousting of the conservative Harper government. Even in these 2 cases where there was an admission on the part of the organization being investigated that they had been trying to influence the election's outcome, Elections Canada found nothing wrong. In the case of Lead Now, I was interviewed. It was a 4-hour interview, if I remember correctly. And I remember at the end of it how frustrated the Elections Canada investor was. And he said, look, you need people like you who are concerned need to get the Elections Act changed because, as you said, we can only enforce it. We can't change it. So I think specifically there's 3 things that need to be tightened. One is the types of activities that are regulated, especially with focus on the online activity. Secondly, the time frame for reporting funds is way too short. And thirdly, non-cash in-kind contributions. That's really where I think the impact is being felt. The second point I'd like to make, and I'll be brief, is that to make our elections more robust to outside interference, actually, I believe it's at the CRA, but we need to see change, and in particular at the Charities Directorate. The reason that this is so important is because charities can, in essence, Canadianize funds, so that once funds have gone through a Canadian charity, in the eyes of Elections Canada, those funds are Canadian. As I see it, the Charities Directorate has been operating largely on an honor system. I say that because over the last 30 years, CRA has only revoked 584 charities. That's an average of 22 charities per year over the past 20 years, 22 charities per year. That's less than 1/10 of 1% of Canada's 86,000 charities, so a negligible number. Since last summer, I should say, CRA has revoked or put into the process of revocation a total of 18 charities run by a single individual, a tax lawyer in Vancouver. These audits, I think, are important to take a look at because they're revealing not only about the charities, but even more importantly, about CRA oversight. One of the important things to note is that these 18 audits took, on average, 10 years from the point of the transaction or the activity that CRA found to be offside and revocation. The range was from 7 years, a minimum of 7 years, to 21 years. That's just far too long. In one case, the audit report was completed in 2012. It took another 11 years before the charity was shut down just last month as of the 25th of March. I draw your attention in particular to the case of How Sound Samaritans Foundation. This is a
Mrs.
Canadian
Crow,
charity.
Miss Krause, sorry, are you
Yes.
close to your end? Because we already.
Yes, two more sentences.
Okay, go ahead.
So How Sound Samaritans, I was just going to mention this charity because they were revoked because they paid the costs of a consultant to provide information to the government of China about charitable activities in Eastern Europe, particularly Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This was paid for via a company called Enabling Environment Endeavors. So I
We
mentioned
will
that
have
just
to,
as
sorry, that's a long
an
two
example.
sentences, so I have to, we're limited in time tonight, and thank you. So I'm going to, if you have opening comments, as always, just share them with the clerk, and we'll get them circulated around for all members. We will enter first round, 6 minutes. Mr. Culkins, followed by Mrs. Romanado, puis Madame Normandin, et puis Madame Blaney. Mr. Culkins?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question will be for Ms. Krause. Would you want to elaborate on what your concerns are again regarding the Charities Directorate at the CRA?
Yes, I think my concern is that the CRA is not enforcing the law and requiring that charities stick to activities that are exclusively charitable. So, the example I was trying to illustrate is here we have a Canadian funded via a Canadian charity providing information to the government of China about what's going on in former Soviet countries. That's not charitable activity. And there's a lot of things. If you read the revocation reports that are coming out, there's some very concerning activities that CRA is revealing. So that it's the nature of the activities that are being conducted. That's a concern number one. And secondly, is the delay. When it's taking 10 years to shut down an errant charity, that's too long. And I guess I could go on. That's on the nature of the types of activities that are occurring. That's a concern. And the other is.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I do want to move on. I'm an Albertan, Ms. Krause, and it's been glaringly obvious to me throughout my political career that money is come across the border through various foundations and charities to advocate against, say, things like the energy sector, against pipeline development. We've seen this, and I know you've spoken on these things a lot as well. And it is interfering not only in our so foreign money can interfere in our domestic affairs in numerous ways if we allow it. And now we've got some relatively serious allegations of money coming into being funneled by a foreign state through proxies in Canada to help certain candidates win elections, win nominations, etc. So I had a bill back in previous Parliament 406 that would have banned third-party advertising for any organization that received foreign funding. And the issue seems to be, especially when it's on the charity side, and I'm wondering what conclusions you can infer when it comes to a foreign state actor and how that would be different. But the problem that I believe Elections Canada has with this is they're not able to sort out the molecules per se, where, without keeping track of separate bank accounts, where the money actually comes from. So what do you think are, that's one of the glaring loopholes that I think we can all agree on here. What are some of the other glaring loopholes that allow foreign money to flow into Canadian charities or into our political process that you think need to be closed?
Well, that's the big question. So I think the answer is, in number one, CRA, is running the charities, the charitable sector on an honor system. There just isn't nearly enough auditing. When you have 80,000 charities and only 0.1% is shut down a year, it's just negligible. So specifically with regards to elections, the two things I saw is that in the investigations that I was part of, is that where organizations were having an influence was via activities that aren't regulated. For example, online activities, or creating a donor base, or developing video content, or creating websites, editing reports, writing speeches, coaching, strategic guidance. None of that were reportable expenditures. So that's one issue. And the second issue is the time frame. Is that what I saw is that so much of the election preparation was done years in advance, you know. So I would say by the time, you know, the 2-year mark came around, 2 years before an election, the groundwork was, you know, the foundations were already laid. And so compare that to the time frame for reportable expenditures, it's a matter of months. So it's very easy to circumvent the rules by making your expenditures before the reporting period even begins.
Could you elaborate? You talked about the types of activities that should be regulated, the time frames. Those are fairly straightforward. But you talked about the non-cash in-kind contributions, which is, I think, is a very difficult thing to track. Could you give us some examples of how you think that's being abused?
Well, there's a lot of online support that you can give to a campaign from outside of Canada. You know, even things like media monitoring or monitoring online activity. That's going to be very, very difficult to control because it can be done from, you know, a beach in Australia or anywhere. I mentioned the beach in Australia because that's actually where the website for Lead Now was created, apparently. But that's part of it. For example, I'll give you another example. The donor, the online donation mechanism for Lead Now was created by an organization based in Washington, D.C. So whenever things online can be prepared by an online consultant anywhere, it's hard to track the expenditures.
One of the rationales the government had for voting against my bill C-406 was that they were going to instead pass Government Bill C-76, which, if you believe the government's talking points of the day, would have closed some of the loopholes in foreign funding of third parties to elections. Do you think C-76 has been a success?
I couldn't answer that question, to be honest. I really couldn't predict.
Thank you. Mrs. Romanato, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here with us this evening. My first question is to Mr. Andre. You brought up some very interesting information with respect to disinformation campaigns and social media. And we all know how disinformation campaigns on social media were used in Crimea and prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We all know that members of parliament have a role to play in terms of informing our constituencies, but we also have a responsibility to make sure that the information that we are providing people is accurate. Now, one of the areas that you mentioned that I think would be interesting to hear a little more about is the evolution of AI and what that can do in terms of misinformation campaigns that are out there. I've seen videos that are obviously faked videos that sound like and look like a person but have been proven to be incorrect. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you're seeing on the ground in this regard, and how can we combat that?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. I think in general, automated content or bot accounts, what is sometimes called coordinated inauthentic behavior by some of the big platforms, has been a tactic used by foreign governments and foreign state actors for quite a number of years. And, that it's a form of automation. But I think the concern is that the sophistication of these tactics is growing, and that AI, and in particular generative AI, where text and video or images can be created more easily, is rapidly getting better, and that it will make the detection efforts that the platforms have tried to ramp up over time less successful. And so that is, I think, the biggest concern is, doctored videos, deepfake images, but text as well, growing in frequency. In terms of what to do about it, I think there have been proposals that basically any synthetic media should be labeled. Of course, there is, legitimate use of synthetic media, that is satirical or, artistic. But, if we're concerned about the spread of misinformation, perhaps there should, be a little label online that on these platforms that informs the user that that's the case. And so if it is, meant to mislead, then the platforms could try to impose labels on these images and try to improve over time, and get to the point of kicking users off the platforms who continue to, post manipulated images without labels, for example. In its most extreme form, sorry if I'm talking too long, there have been suggestions that these generative AI tools like ChatGPT could keep a log of their outputs, and that then the platforms could basically track against that log to automatically add the labels, which, again, these are ideas that people are putting forward to try to address the risks.
Okay, and so this may sound like a little bit of a bizarre question, but given your experience and your expertise in governance, we have parliamentary privilege in the House of Commons, which means during question period, during debate, we can make statements as long as we're using proper language and not using unparliamentary language. But we can state things in the House that could be incorrect. We have, I'd like to say all 38 million Canadians are watching CPAC and watching QP and watching us all the time. But for those who are watching, I would anticipate that you would agree with me that we also have a responsibility as members of Parliament to make sure that the content we are creating in the House of Commons in terms of what we are saying is also factually correct. Because otherwise, hiding behind parliamentary privilege to claim make statements in the House that is actually misleading and or disinformation. Would you agree that as parliamentarians we have a responsibility to make sure that the information we are creating is also accurate, and that any clips that we are taking for social media using parliamentary, Parlview or our parliamentary resources to then post on social media a clip that's missing some of the preamble or whatever, would you say that that would mean that we are creating disinformation campaigns as well?
It's a tricky question. I would say I want to draw a distinction between, the cut and thrust of domestic political actors, talking to their constituents, and foreign disinformation, and the appropriate response to those things is, I think, understandably different. Of course, I agree with the general premise of what you're saying, which is, in an ideal state, our democracy is based on, evidence and facts, and that the voters are being, informed correctly. But, what is true and what is false in a domestic debate context is, subjective, of course.
And I'm out of time, so I'll give that back to the chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Madame Normande.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question for Mr. Andre, and I'm very interested in what you said, and with regard to what Mr. Turnbull said, I'd wonder if there is, can you compare an disinformation campaign on WeChat, and with regard to deceitful information, and in your surveys are people more distrustful of things from a political party, or they suspect political motivation, or are there as opposed to things that might be shared by their colleagues or peers?
I'll start with your first question. In general, the use of messaging apps, things like WhatsApp or WeChat, for news, when people say that they use that as a source of news, they are more likely to then also believe in misinformation. And it is, in the sort of scheme of types of media, among the worst in terms of effects on people's belief in misinformation. And so it is, I think, a concerning way that people are accessing news. There is a inherent trust in the media that you receive through these messaging apps. It comes from, friends and colleagues. It's different than, news presented, say, on a feed where you might just scroll on by. It has a higher likelihood to be read and sort of a higher propensity to believe it. And so, yes, I think in short, but if I've misunderstood your question, please feel free to elaborate. In terms of the question about do people trust political parties, we haven't directly asked that question, so I couldn't answer that.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. One of the challenges with regard to online information is identifying the source, especially in a case of possible interference. But what about tools, quick information spots that might, or identifiers that might make people think about it? For example, a tweet that might have been redistributed and where you might be able to see that it came from a specific location, for example, Canada or elsewhere, because it's difficult to find the source of information.
Yes, absolutely. And a feature that used to be on Twitter where you could see the location of the tweet was removed recently in the Twitter's ownership change, which has been a slight setback in that kind of transparency that you describe. I would say this whether it's domestic or foreign is at the heart of this debate, of course, right? And what is, I've been watching the kind of past meetings and the ability to in a short amount of time in an election to understand the source is sometimes not possible, of course, which relates to the threshold for mitigative communications. So I think while it's important to focus on what we can do about foreign disinformation through Elections Act and through the penalties, I think it's also important to focus on what we can do in general about misinformation, regardless of its source, and how we can make the platforms healthier places for democratic discourse, which I think goes back to focusing on automated content, focusing on nudges to encourage people to check things in different labels as you described.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Something that you mentioned that can counter disinformation is when people try to check on the information they receive from external sources, for example, the media. But and in the study about the Chinese population, are they disadvantaged by the fact that external sources, reliable external sources in their maternal language, are not really available?
Absolutely, and in fact, we find, just as one example, French language Canadians are less likely to believe in misinformation, and it's been proposed that it is in part because of the English language media ecosystem in which this information flows up principally from the United States to Canada, that the French media ecosystem is less susceptible to. So I think there's all sorts of linguistic dynamics in our information ecosystem. I think specific to your question about diaspora communities or Chinese language communities, I think one potential solution that we shouldn't overlook is the importance of local media, Chinese language newspapers and other, smaller outlets that can be a voice and a vehicle to address that. And I think, the federal government has made some efforts around supporting journalism, and I think more of that is needed, because I think that is a key way to address that concern.
Merci beaucoup, c'est tout le temps que j'avais.
Thank you very much.
Merci à vous.
Thank you to you.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I thank the witnesses for being here today. I really appreciate your testimony. Mr. Andre, I'm going to ask you the questions that I have today. I thought it was very interesting when you talked, when I read about the survey of online harms in Canada, the information was interesting. So I guess I'm really curious, because I know that Canadians' use of social media is growing. I represent a more rural and remote riding, and so one of the challenges for small communities across Canada is local papers are really struggling to find ways to survive in this economy, and there's not as much support for them to make sure that there's actually accredited journalists doing the work and making sure the information is true and factual. And so I'm just curious about this. You also said in there that Canadians are ready to see action taken on this issue. So, I guess what I'm curious about is how are people making decisions about what a trusted source is when they go online? And if we're going to combat misinformation, what kind of thought do you have around what we could provide so that people know if this is a trusted source or not?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a few things. So we have been tracking trust in mainstream media as well as in social media for the last 4 years. I think the good news is that most of our mainstream media, things like CBC, the Globe and Mail, CTV, Global News, are highly trusted institutions among most Canadians. And while it has slipped slightly through the pandemic, which is a global phenomenon, not just in Canada, not significantly. On the other hand, trust in social media continues to fall. In fact, less than 1 in 10 Canadians now say they have a high degree of trust in Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. So I think Canadians are getting the message about where they can access trustworthy information in some respects. On the other hand, though, use of these platforms, as you say, and use of these platforms for news continues to grow. So these are at a bit of odds, if that makes sense. And I think, to your point, it relates to how we're consuming information, how we're using our phones, the ability to access forms of media like local media. There's a bunch of factors that contribute to that are worrisome. But I wanted to answer your question specifically about trust.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And I guess the other question that I have is you talked a lot about ethnic media, and I think today we had testimony earlier in the day that talked about different countries resourcing media within Canada. And so there should be more accountability about how people are trained, what resources they're getting. I think that's an important part. But, I'm just wondering, when you did this research, was there any particular research that you did on social media that was in different languages that was in Canada? Or was it just on the French and English? And is that a gap that we need to see more resources to do more research on to make sure that those methods are really being held to account and that we can support that sort of transparency?
It's a really good question. We have done one study 2 years ago, specifically around messaging apps, and we dug into WeChat in particular. But private messaging apps tend to be a key vehicle for diaspora communities. So, for example, WhatsApp is heavily used in the South Asian community in Canada. Telegram is used by the Russian and sort of Eastern European communities. Different apps are used differently. It's easy to communicate back home. There's also already groups with family and friends, etc. But having said all that, in general, the use of these apps is associated with higher exposure to and belief in misinformation. And people who use those apps say that they receive misinformation. I think it was about 40% said they receive it at least a few times a month. And WhatsApp, WeChat, and Telegram sort of stood out among those. And so we haven't looked specifically at language, but I think that the findings we have are decent proxies for that. Does that help?
That does help. Thank you. The last question I have is, it says here that 15% of Canadians have a high degree of belief in misinformation. And this really makes me think of living through the convoy and watching, journalists go on live television right there, and they were asking people to share their thoughts, and they just kept yelling fake news and wouldn't say anything. And so I just, watched that, and I was like, this is so odd. In any of the work that you've done, is there clarity about why this 15% is believing more misinformation? And what can we do to sort of remind people of the fact that Canada's got some good things that we should look at, and where is that distrust, and what can we do? Because it was mind-boggling to me when you have a microphone in front of your face and you can tell everyone whatever, that they couldn't even think of a word to say.
It's a great question. I think it's the key question. I think there's concern that this group is growing and that the online information ecosystem is making it worse. Maybe I'll say, conspiratorial beliefs have always existed. In some ways, we are focusing new attention on a thing that has always existed and maybe was never tracked adequately. But yes, there is a minority of Canadians who we sort of categorize as having a high belief in misinformation, which was that they believed at least 6 of 8 statements that were common misinformation about a kind of a range of topics.
Thank you, Mr. Andre. Don't be sorry. We appreciate the information that you have provided to us, and I'd like to thank Mr. Andre and Ms. Krause for the information. I would just like to say, if there's anything else you would like committee members to know, please do share it with the clerk. We'll have it translated in both official languages and shared with members. We are heading off to 2 votes, and because it will take a little bit longer, we will not return. So we wish you a good rest of the day. We thank you for the information you've provided. To members, we will see you on Thursday at 10 a.m. in room 025B, and with that, meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.